What's up, YouTube? In this video, we're going to be looking at streaming. Streaming is a feature that was introduced in .NET, again, probably version 3.5. Yeah, same time the yield return was introduced. If you haven't watched my video on the iterator pattern, please watch that so you can get a better sense of what this video is about. So streams and streaming are not in the least bit connected to each other. They have absolutely no connection whatsoever. So streaming has nothing to do with streams, and streams don't mean streaming. Streaming is the term used for what I'm going to show you here. Maybe you've seen this done before and not called it streaming, but this is what streaming is. And it's important to understand this streaming and what it really is so that you can understand the next video, which is on the C# feature Async Streams. All right? Okay. And the prerequisite to this video is the iterator pattern. I'll link to that over here. If you haven't watched that video, please watch that before you watch this one. All right, let's get started. So I'm starting from the previous code. I'm just going to delete all this code so it doesn't clutter up the project here. And I've got some code here that works with movies. It's just a collection, and I've got a database that feeds, that has about 1,000, 2,000 records in it. And we're going to be using that database to extract the data and display it here on the console. So I have a class called the movie data manager. And the movie data manager has a method on it that's called getAllMovies. And this returns to us an IEnumerable of movie, all right? And then we simply iterate over this collection, or sequence is better. The right term for something that is an IEnumerable is a sequence, not a collection. All right, so movies. And then I'm just going to print out the movie's title, which is a string property. All right. So conceptually, you should understand there's nothing really complicated. There's some class that gets us all the movies. Where the movies come from is not necessarily relevant in this particular case, because I'm using streaming and it's coming from a database. It would be coming from a network service or a file system directly. Either ways, it's streaming, but has no connection to do with streams. Okay. All right. Then once I have the movies, I'm iterating over the collection and I'm printing out the title. So once again, I'm going to put a breakpoint here. And we are going to not put a breakpoint here. We want it to do this and come back to us with a bunch of movies. And then we want to stop here before we iterate over the collection. So let's see what happens now. So when I run this video, and I'm going to put a breakpoint here in the getAllMovies method as well. All right. So the getAllMovies method is called before, and then that returns the collection, and then we iterate over this the collection of movies. So let's see what happens when we run this application. So it stopped here, and it does this part here, and then it goes to map movies and does this thing. You don't have to worry about this part. Basically, what I'm getting is data from a database, and I map it to the movie DTO collection over here. Right, so that's the key part to keep in mind at this point, that I new up a list. I iterate over the data reader, and for every record in the data reader, I create a new instance of a movie, add it to the list, and eventually when I'm done with that iteration and all the data extraction from the database, I return the collection over here, which then returns it from there, and so on. So it stopped in the getAllMovies part. And then when I run through that, it'll come in, stop in the for each. So at this point, we have these movies. You can see there's 2,000 movies in this collection, which is relevant, but there's some data there. And then when we run through this, it's going to print out the title. All right, so far so good. Nothing new or different here. I'm guessing most of you have done this kind of code and it is familiar. If it's not, I'll make the code available on my GitHub. The link will be in the show notes below. Take a look at it there. Make sure you understand this code. Well, unfortunately, the code that I'm going to be putting up in GitHub may not be this step or this version of it. So I'm hoping you understand these are the general simple way of doing this, since there's nothing unusual in what I just did. Now I'm going to make a change to this implementation here, this map to movies. I'm going to make a change to that. Instead of accumulating this in a list, I'm going to remove that list, and I'm going to remove that. And here, instead of adding it to a list, since now we don't have a list, I am going to yield return it. All right. So nothing else changes because the signature has not changed as far as the call side is concerned, the call side being here. It has no notion of the implementation. But I've changed the implementation to go from not using the iterator pattern to using the iterator pattern. As we saw in the previous video, the yield return is the iterator pattern, and that's how it's implemented in C#.NET. And so I'm doing a yield return in the loop. So while the data is coming out of the database, as I get the record, I yield return it and so on. So it's similar to the previous one where we were working with integers. In this case, we're working with movie data coming from a database. My breakpoint is still here on the get all movies. My breakpoint is still here on the for each. Let's run this application to see what happens this time. This time, it still come in here. That is, oh yes, I didn't mean to put the breakpoint on the movie, get all movies part. I intended to put the breakpoint here on the map to movies part. In the previous code, it would have still come here. So because it's going to call that, we're really interested in the implementation here. Okay, run it again. Okay, so this time you'll see that it didn't go into the map movies method here. It seems to have skipped this method, just like it did before in the iterator thing, right? Nothing, no surprise now, I guess. And as I start to iterate over the movie collection here, as soon as it comes into the, trying to get to the single movie, that's when it comes into this method for the first time. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. And then it comes here. At this point, is reading the data reader from the database for the first time. And, oops. Did I make a mistake in the coding here? Data reader is closed. Yes, because when I do the execute reader, I need to give it the behavior. So command behavior. Command behavior.close connection. Yeah, I don't want to close the connection in the finally here. I want to close the connection when the command is done. I want the command to close the connection when the command is done. So I'm just going to not do this part. Okay, let's try this once again. Okay, so it's coming to the for each, and it comes to movies, and then when it comes to get the single movie, it comes here for the first time, and it stopped at this breakpoint, and then it goes to the next line, next line. Now this time it does the yield return of the entire movie. So it's read one record from the database so far, or is in the process of reading that one record and hydrating an instance of a movie from that data. And then I should probably have skipped this stuff here because this has to parse the genre from a string to a genre. Okay. So now that it's come here, it's constructing the movie. And finally, it comes here with that single movie. I'm hoping what you're going to get to understand here is now when you do the next iteration, next item in the sequence, you'll find that it comes back where it left off here. So basically it returned here in the previous iteration. And then for the next item, it comes back where it left off. So it's sort of re-entered this method where it left off in the next execution, line of execution. So it's basically come here. And now it's going to read the next record from the database and then come back and yield return this movie, and so on and so forth. This is how it's going to work out. So if you watched the iterator pattern video previously, you understand the behavior is the same, except this time the data is coming out of a database. And as one record comes out of the database, that one record is being sent out all the way to the program CS file and printed out of the console. And then it's going back and getting the next record and printing out of the console. Now, it turns out that the data reader in .NET, ADU.NET, is also streaming. So I'm hoping you can get this idea. You query the database, and the database is accumulating the data it's going to be returning to you. But the database is not waiting to accumulate all the data. Let's say there's 1 million records and you fire a certain criteria, a certain query with a certain criteria. It's not waiting for all the data to be materialized before it starts to return the data that's already found. That's what a data reader does in ADU.NET. And because we are streaming in our C# code, the code we've written in C# is using the streaming feature in C# using the yield return keyword in C#. As the first record is found by the database, it streams that out through the data reader to our code here. Our code takes that record, converts that to a movie, and returns it to the console application. The console application prints out that video to the console. And then it goes back and gets the next record coming from the database, does the same thing, and it goes out and does the same thing. So streaming, if you can imagine what streaming looks like, it's like data coming, one record coming out of the database, gets converted to a movie, gets printed to the console, comes back, gets converted to a movie, printed out of the console, comes back. So it's streaming. Is as soon as the data is available, the system starts to react and starts to continue on one record at a time. I mean, I think that is like the coolest thing. It's probably a difficult concept to understand. Maybe I'm not explaining it correctly, but if hopefully you can visualize what I'm saying. As a record comes out of the database, typically when you do the list thing, a record comes out of the database, we put in a list item, so we're adding to the list. So it's like it comes into our data layer and it's waiting around for 2000 iterations to accumulate 2000 movies before it even goes back to the caller, which is the console application. So there's a dead time involved. But even though we have the data, we are not giving the data to the UI or the console. We are accumulating a collection of n number before we return the collection. So there are two things that are occurring. One, the time, right? You're waiting and you're iterating over the collection. And then you return the result. Well, maybe there's three things happening. The third is the memory that's being used by the collection. And we haven't talked about that yet. I haven't shown you the sort of modified code to explain that. The third thing is the number of iterations. Let's say you're building a web API application, and this application is returning JSON of, in this case, the movie. So you get a single movie record from the database. You convert that to a C# DTO. You take the DTO, you convert that to JSON, and then you stream out the JSON from a web API or XML, whatever the case is. You're doing that. Imagine I'm guessing the general normal implementation you have. You get 1 million records from the database. For every record, you create an instance of a movie DTO. But you have iterated over that collection, that 1 million records or 1,000 records, whatever the case is, so many times. So 1,000 iterations or 1 million iterations have already occurred for you to accumulate the 1,000 or the 1 million records. And you have created new instances of this DTO, 1,000 or 1 million instances. Then you take that and give it to, let's say, your controller. Your controller takes that and has to iterate over that collection once again to produce the JSON or the XML. How many iterations were there? 2 iterations. So if you have 1,000 records, then you iterate over this 2,000 times. And you accumulated the memory of 1,000 movies in order to do this work. I'm guessing that's how you do things today, even though this feature of streaming has been available in C# since, as I said, 3.5, so that's like 2005, 2006 timeframe. With streaming, I've shown you one half of the streaming, which is rather than accumulating or waiting to accumulate, I'm returning the records as I'm getting the records, but I'm still creating. If you look at the code base here, there's a new movie for each record. And you would think, yeah, well, why wouldn't you not create a new instance? Of course you would create a new instance. That's the trick here. Now, I'm not sure this is a well-known trick or well-known by many people, but this is what actually can be done. You don't need a new instance each time, with certain caveats. So let's say for the same example, I was talking about streaming to JSON or streaming to XML. If you're streaming, then as you get the data from the database, you set the values of your movie object. Think of this as not a new movie instance, it's a pre-existing movie class object instance. But you set all the property values based on this record's information. And you send that out to your web API layer. The web API takes that, because it doesn't know it to be streaming. It's iterating over the collection like we're doing in the console application here. We're not doing anything about streaming here. We're simply iterating over the collection. Newtonsoft JSON or the new .NET 3.0 JSON serializers are going to take that collection and going to start iterating over that collection. And as they iterate over the collection, they're going to convert that thing to JSON. So let's say you had only one instance of a movie. So the movie object, there's only one instance, right? But you set the properties every time you get a new record. And then you give it to the JSON side, the controller side. It takes that movie's data, converts that to JSON. Then your control comes back to you and you get the next record from the database, set the properties of the movie object again to the new records data, and send that out streaming to the JSON Newtonsoft, and it produces the JSON for the next record, except the next record is the same movie object, but with different records, different data. Don't believe me? Okay, let's check it out. Unfortunately, I've got random data in the database, so it might be difficult to see the difference. So if you look at the titles, every title should be different. It's all random ASCII, but you'll see there's no duplication. But I'm going to change the code first. So what I'm saying is, instead of newing up a new instance of a movie for every record found here, what if I take this part of the code and move it outside of the loop? All right. So I say, here's a new movie. And then instead of saying return new movie, I'm just going to say return movie. Right? But for the movie, I need to set all these properties. So let's say over here, I'm going to say, movie dot, what's the title is equal to this. So I need to make sure that I set all the property values. I can't be stupid about leaving some property values unset, because that would cause some other issues. So I have to just make sure when I do something like this, that all my properties have been set to the new values or reset to a default value or whatever the reset value would be in your system, right? Okay, so all I've just done is copied the code from there to here. So I set to the same movie instance. So while I'm iterating over this while loop here, the movie collection is the same. It's not going to come back here over and over. Like, it's just going to do this one line once. And then from that point forward, it's going to yield return, come back around, next record, yield return, and keep doing this in this loop here. It'll never hit that more than one time. So you only have one instance of a movie. And here, you're setting the values to the new records data and returning it. So if what I'm saying is correct, then when we see the titles of each of the movies being printed out here, they should be different, because the data in the database, the title is unique. It's unfortunately random data, so it may not make sense to you, but let's see if you can see that it's unique. So I'm just going to run this application. What did I mess up here? Yeah, don't have that. All right. So I've left the breakpoints here, so you can see how it's working. So it comes into the map movies for the very first time at the point of entry. Then it executes the new movie line. So we now have an instance of a movie with all the properties defaults. So actually the default genre. Comes in here for the very first time, sets all the values to the new records. You can see the title here is there. Can you see that? Okay, so that's the title of the first movie. All right. So now we're going to continue on. It's now come back here as we would expect, because it actually came here first, but then came back into this method to then get the instance, movie instance. And now it's printing that same lowercase a, uppercase a, 7, open paren title, right? And then it comes back. It left here, so it has re-entered here. I'm saying re-entered is not necessarily re-entered, but that's how you want to think about conceptually about streaming and the iterator pattern in .NET. This come here, goes back, gets the next record. So the first record, assume, has already been JSONified. Right? We are seeing it in the console. It's already there. Right? It's already been printed out of the console. Now when you come here, this movie title currently is still the older title, right? So this is still the older title, or the previous title. But now when we come in here, oops, what did I do here? Okay, it's going to set it to another title. So it's resetting all the values. Comes back out here, all right? Comes back, and this time it's going to print the new title. So effectively, with a single instance of a movie, if we are using streaming, no matter how many records have to be returned, we can use one movie, or whatever the DTOs that you're using, instance to return millions of records and never have the problem of the same record being repeated. There's a caveat, but I hope you understand this part. This is streaming at its best, as in the previous version was also streaming, but it was creating, let's say, potentially 1 million movie instances to return 1 million movies, or to convert 1 million movies to JSON. We created, even though we don't need the 1 million DTOs, because our newtons of JSON requires a movie DTO, we have to accumulate a collection of 1 million movies to give to JSON, newtons of JSON, which will then convert that to JSON. So that wasn't an incorrect implementation, but it can get better, which is what I'm showing you here. You can use one instance and still pull it off. And rather than creating 1 million instances, because you don't need the instances, you only need the instances to give it to newtons of JSON. So if you have a need like that, why bother creating multiple instances or so many instances of some DTO when you're going to throw them away right in the next instant as soon as you got your XML or JSON or what have you? All right. Hopefully that's making sense. All right. So now, and of course this will go right through, and we'll see in the console application that all the, just going to remove the breakpoint. And you notice it never came here more than that one time, the first time. So it's never going to come back here again for that one iteration. And now if we look at our every one of these is a unique title. They're random, very, very random and unique. So I know they're unique, but the code is not repeating it. So at least that much is clear. All right. So if this makes sense, this should be blowing your mind, isn't it? You're saying, how is that possible? So I suggest downloading this code from GitHub, playing with it. This is the version of code that you're going to see in GitHub. Download it, play with it. There's a database involved. You're going to have to feed data in. Don't have to put 1 million records in there, but do it by hand. And now you'll have access to that code base, and you can play with it, debug through it step by step and play with it. There is a caveat here, just like in the previous one. There is a caveat here. So the caveat from the previous iterator method or iterator pattern video is still the same. If you need to iterate over this collection multiple times, then you need to or should put a to list here, because otherwise you're going to be calling your database multiple times, right? So if you know you're going to take this movies collection and from this point forward, you might iterate over this movies collection n number of times, not just once, then you should should use the toList method here so that it doesn't end up calling the database, in this case, multiple times. So that caveat still is the same as the caveat I talked about in the iterator pattern, because it's still the iterator pattern. The streaming part, where I'm showing you the single instance here, right? There's a caveat to this as well in addition to that, and I'm hoping this all makes sense to you. If I'm doing the streaming the way I'm doing it now with this single instance of a movie, all right, and then I do a toList, what's going to happen is the list is going to contain only the last movie's data. The entire collection will contain the same movies. The data will be the same. The instances will be different though. The toList does produce multiple instances, but the only data it gets then, because not it doing the for eaching, it's doing the toList here, you're going to get all copies of the same item, the last one. Okay, and we can see that. So we know the first movie's title is lowercase a, uppercase A, I think 7 and open plan or something it was, right? So at least we know that's the first title. I'm going to do a toList now. Our implementation is still using the single instance, and I'm just going to remove all these breakpoints. We don't need them anymore. So it's doing the yield return on a movie, but the movie is the same instance being used for every record. Okay. And here I've added that the only change I made is I've added a toList to the end of this call to get all movies, with the intention that I plan to iterate over this multiple times. And if that's the case, I should use a toList that's going to go to the database multiple times, which is not something you want. All right. So now if I were to look at the 2000 movies here, instances, you'll find that their title is, in this case, is YX0%, right? The next one also is YX0% and so on. So they all have the same data. So in other words, even though these instances are different in the list, the data it got was that of the last movie, which is sort of makes sense. If you're not using the data as soon as it was given to you, and you're in turn again waiting to accumulate it, then you're going to get the last one, because the movie reference is the same reference. We're just setting properties to it, different properties each record, each iteration. So the list is unfortunately a list of the same thing. So if you do have to iterate over this thing multiple times, in other words, if you have to use the toList, then this optimization of using the same instance is not valid. You can still use the previous implementation, which was doing the yield return, but we were creating a new instance of a movie object each time. That is still valid. It's still called streaming. Just don't get the benefit of the less memory. So streaming in this case is the fact that we're using the yield return or the iterator pattern along with, let's say, a database, a file system, or a network service, or whatever it is, that is getting the data to you over a wire. So it's coming to you bits and pieces at a time, and as a result of which it's streaming to you, which is why those things are called streams. And you are returning that as you get the data. You're not accumulating it. So the idea of streaming is you're using the yield return keyword in C# to return the data as soon as you get it. So it's a streaming mechanism rather than accumulate and return, right? And that's really what streaming is about. Now, I hope this is making sense. I hope the iterator video before this one also made sense, because these two ideas now we're going to take forward into another video for a new feature in C#, which is very exciting, called the Async Streams in C# 8, right? So stay tuned, and I'll see you in that video. And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Please hit the notify button. Send me your comments if you have any questions. Until then, I will see you next time.